Bharat is the foundation of these cultural norms and narrative. It is the epicenter of this, whether it's the Mahakumbh that you have seen recently and its impact on economic ideas. If you're from a Baniya community, how do Baniyas react? How do they make choices? What are the factors that they take into account? I come from Tamil Nadu. In my ancestral village, except for the main bazaar street, most of the other streets are very clean and they are very well equipped with Swachhata clinics. Hi, this is Sriram Balasubramanian, economist and best-selling author of Kautilyanomics for Modern Times and Dharmanomics. My areas of research are in international macroeconomics, growth models, and the role of cultural norms and narratives. In other countries, it has had an impact, but Bharat is the foundation of these cultural norms and narratives. It is the epicenter of this, whether it's the Mahakumbh that you have seen recently and its impact on economic ideas or economic outcomes, or the variety of temples across the country and the impact of festivals on economic outcomes. So in this context, I think Dharma-based economic frameworks, which is an important part of my research, where I argue that over a period of, say, the last 1,500 years, starting from Kautilya's Arthashastra, or even earlier, the role of Dharma plays a very, very important role in the societal fabric of Bharat. I define it through the prism of ethics, responsibilities, and engaging with the rest of the world. I argue that Kautilya's Arthashastra provides us a framework called Dharmic capitalism, which I map to the contemporary Bharatiya economy and how some of these ideas can be applied in terms of taxation, in terms of trade, in terms of inequality, in terms of labor contracts, the day-to-day contracts that you have, say, in terms of employment, how, Kautilya had envisaged some of these ideas. Subsequently, I also deal with the common era kingdoms, the Cholas, Pallavas, Pandyas, Cambodia, Southeast Asia, and how not only Kautilyan Dharmic capitalism, but also the role of temple-based economies based on the Dharmic ecosystem. Why is the temple in most of the villages in Bharat the central sort of piece of that village? And is it just a religious entity? Of course it is, which serves its main purpose, but it serves a much wider economic purpose around the village. And most villages drive an economic activity based on the temples. And because you have tourism, you have support infrastructure coming in, you have employment created. A lot of these things are created based on the temple-based economic ecosystem. So in Dharmanomics, I deal with this in the Cholas, Pallavas, and the ancient kingdoms. And then, of course, we talk about the role of corporate guilds, sort of ancient MNCs, and how they had similar structures to modern-day corporations, and what some of the lessons that that we could learn from them. How is this relevant today? And I think that's a very important question. I would like to take you back to the cultural norms and narratives I mentioned earlier. The entire sort of dharmic way of life is a continuous process even today. It affects us at the individual level, at the corporate level, at the policy level. At the individual level, most of our discretionary economic choices, in simple lingo, non-essential economic choices, is largely driven by our cultural way of life throughout the year. So when you spend money on Diwali, for example, you spend money, most of our, for instance, the UPI transactions, the most UPI transactions for the last year happened during the month of Diwali. So much of our expenditure is linked to these cultural norms and narratives at the individual level. And when we make choices, other bigger economic choices, most of it is aligned to our upbringing, our culture, our sort of approach from a familial perspective over a period of time on how we make these choices. At the corporate level, you look at the Ambanis and the Adanis of the world, much, unlike the West, for instance, most of their business choices aren't completely on rationality. Profit and loss is an important component of it, but not necessarily the only component. I think there's a much wider community-based approach that drives their choices. For instance, if you're from a Baniya community, how do Baniyas react? How do they make choices? What are the factors that they take into account? Businesses who belong to that community, for instance. So most of the corporates in India are family-driven corporates. And most of these businesses have a unique sort of decision-making apparatus which is linked to the cultural norms and narratives. At the policy level, from a sort of an eagle's perspective, from a much bigger perspective, what one sees is that this combination of the individual and the corporate is translating into policy, which means for a policy to be effective, one needs to ensure that the policy is aligned to this cultural way of life, according to my research. More often than not, what we have done is especially, post-independent India for a long time, you had a bunch of experts who were educated abroad, who lived in the cities, and their worldview was restricted towards that. And they were prescribing a set of policies, most of them well-intentioned, no doubt, but most of it not aligned to this way of life. The way of life is struggling to sort of, align that policy, for them to have an uptake. Whereas more recently, what you notice is that, people who have spent many years trying to understand, experience Bharat and this way of life, find that, when you align policy to this way of life, policy making becomes even more effective. So for instance, if you take the Swachh Bharat initiative, have you ever wondered why the Swachh Bharat initiative is far more successful in the rural areas compared to the urban places that all of you live? For instance, I come from Tamil Nadu. In my ancestral village, except for the main bazaar street, most of the other streets are very clean and they are very well, equipped with, say, the Swachhata clinics and an awareness created. So I was just having this chat with the local vendor in Tamil and I was asking him about some of the changes. So I was very surprised to note that, the local vendor told me that he sees this as his dharmic responsibility now to take care of his neighborhood and make it clean. And, what I noticed is that the scheme was conceptualized with a huge sort of apparatus of both the administration as well as the Honorable Prime Minister and the entire system, where a sort of a consciousness was created. I call it dharmic consciousness, but to ensure that cleanliness is not restricted only to their houses, but also to the outside. So as a result, what happens is that individual whom I spoke about sees it as a collective responsibility for him or her to do it. And irrespective of who's in power, he or she is going to go about doing this and keeping their neighborhood clean. So this is an example of policy making aligned to the way of life. And the effectiveness of policy making becomes far more higher if it is aligned to the way of life. And this is what some of my research sort of alludes to. So in conclusion, what we've just discussed is that much of the past, a lot of countries who aspire to become economic superpowers have evolved as sort of an indigenous model as a foundation based on which they bring in other ideas. Similarly, for Bharat to pursue Viksit Bharat, given how culturally driven our country is, my humble submission is that the cultural way of life, the cultural norms and narratives needs to be aligned to policy making. And this Dharma-based economic framework provides a good foundation. So I highlighted some of my research from my books to sort of provide a time series over a period of time. And then we also discussed about the impact on the individual, corporate and public policy level, and why aligning these cultural norms and narratives to the broader public policy spectrum is very important for greater policy efficiency. So as we pursue Viksit Bharat, I think it's important to expand this and bring in best practices from the outside to facilitate and expand these ideas. Thank you.